Hello there everybody, my name is Ironside and welcome to this Lies of P video guide on stats, weapons, weapon scaling. Let's just get right into it with stats. So early in the game, you're going to unlock the ability to level up, you're going to be met with this screen, and if you're anything like me, you'll have no idea what most of this means. So let's go through them one by one. Before we touch on what each individual stat does, let's touch on what they all do. So every time you level up any of these stats, your damage reduction is going to increase. You can see on the right hand side of the screen, highlighted in blue, if I improve my vitality, all those defenses go up. Now, that is the case with any of these stats. However, two exceptions. Vigor only increases the physical defense, and Advance only increases elemental defense. So let's talk about Vitality. This is your run-of-the-mill HP stat that every game in the world works with. You improve your Vitality, and as you can see, I'm currently at 562. If I add a point, I'll go up to 574. Pretty simple. Now, what we also see improve at the bottom there is Guard Regain. And Guard Regain is, if you are not aware, whenever you guard against an attack, if your guard is not a perfect guard, you will take damage. Now, a portion of your health bar will be left discolored, and you can regain that health by either running around and not taking damage, or by hitting an enemy and expediting the rate of that increase. So increasing HP improves your guard regain. Vigor is your stamina. There's not much to say on that. Stamina is used for dashing and dodging and attacking and guarding. Anything you do in combat probably uses stamina. This game is pretty generous with its baseline stamina. You can still get out plenty of attacks on, the baseline amount. So a couple points in there doesn't go amiss. I don't think you need to go crazy with it. Capacity. This is your weight stat that you see in Souls-like games. And I think a lot of people who played Souls-like games might stray away from this stat initially, not think it is much use. And I'm going to explain why that's not true. So let's start with, obviously, it allows you to equip higher defensive parts. Now, there is an argument that if you play well enough, you don't need defensive parts, right? So sure, we can ignore that for now. All of your weapons have varying weight to them, and you can even equip a second weapon to swap mid-combat. I think that's a little too costly with the weight, but you can do it if you want. Legion arms, all of them have an innate weight to them, and you must always have a Legion arm equipped, but the weight varies from arm to arm. Now, the important thing is amulets, or they might be talismans in other games, rings in other games. These increase different things about your character, and importantly, some of them are pretty strong. So here we have increased damage from weapons once you perfect guard. Here we have increased physical damage upon attacking. But if you look at the weight on these, that's 25. That's over a quarter of my total weight just from these two amulets. So increasing your weight can be important. And you might ask, why wouldn't I go to very, very heavy weights? Well, if we try that, slightly heavy, we find that we actually run slower, and you can't see it just now, but also the rate at which your stamina regens is also slower. So that's really a personal choice, but I prefer to not be in heavy load. But I definitely would not write off capacity as a stat. The other thing it does is it improves your Legion, which is the bar at your bottom left, which determines how much you can use your Legion arm ability. So that's a nice little side effect of that. These last three stats are all your main attacking stats. So motivity, that's more like strength in other games. That tends to impact weapons which are bigger, slower, bulkier. Technique when you improve it, it's more for weapons which are slender, quicker, and smaller. This would be more like dexterity in other games. As you can see, both would improve my physical attack. And then we have advance. Advance is a bit different. Advance is your elemental stat, right? So I don't have a... I'm not getting a bonus from this right now, but essentially Advance would increase only the electric blitz attack on my weapon. Advance will never improve any of your physical offense or defense. Different Legion arms scale with different stats as well. So for example, the Falcon Eyes, that scales with technique. The Flamberge scales with advance because it's fire. So these aren't hard rules on those last three stats in terms of weapon types and scaling, but that's a general idea. So now let's move on to discussing weapons and how they're made, what each of them do, right? Or what a blade and a handle does. There are two types of different weapon. Primarily, there are special weapons, which use different items to upgrade. They use dark moonstones of the Covenant. You get those from giving boss ergo to a particular vendor. I'm not going to touch on that right now. What I will discuss is normal weapons. So normal weapons are split into two constituent parts. You have the blade and you have the handle. The blade determines a couple of different things. Most of it is detailed here. So the blade changes the type of damage that your weapon will do. So as you can see, most of these are physical. This one does electric blitz damage. This one does acid damage. That changes depending on which blade you use. Charge pulse cells. Once you are out of pulse cells, which are your health potions, by dealing damage to an enemy, you can recharge up to a maximum of 1 pulse charge. But once you use it, you can recharge again. And different weapons will charge that at a different rate. And finally, Fable Charge. So that is how quickly your Fable bar, your blue bars, which allow you to do special attacks with your handle and with your blade, different weapons charge that Fable at a different rate as well. The other thing that isn't detailed here is that weapon blade type will change the type of fatal attack you do, and we will go over and explore that in a second. But quickly, let's touch on handles before we go over there. Handles, I would argue, are the more important aspect of your weapon, except in cases where you're changing damage type. The handle is often more important because it determines two different things. It determines the weapon scaling, so how that weapon improves relative to your stats. But what it doesn't say here is that it also changes the move set of your weapon. The blade will do a different move set relative to the handle. Okay, so let's go and explore some of that right now. First, let's start by showing you what this does. This is the electric shock head on a chef knife handle. As you can see, it's small, upward strikes pretty quick, and there's the R2 from it, right? Now, if we go back in, we talk to our lovely lady here and assemble weapons. If we change that to, say, the acidic spear handle, immediately you can see aesthetically it's a longer weapon, and the way in which you attack with the weapon changes. Now, let's see different fatal attacks, right? So, here's one fatal attack. That's a pretty common one, 4 strikes. Then let's change to this big boy right here. We do a fatal attack with this, and you'll see that 1, 2. It's a different fatal attack. Now, That doesn't really have a huge impact on the game overall, I would say.
You are here.
But it is something potentially worth keeping in mind. And what I will do now is show you that if I change my electric stick to have that handle, even though it changes the move set because I changed the handle, because I'm still using the coil, it's still going to do those 4 fast attacks. So where it can matter is, you know, I'm using a big beefy moveset here, but actually because of the stick head, the blade, it's a very fast fatal attack. So there are combos that can happen there, but as I said, I don't think it ends up making a huge impact on the game. And the last thing I'm going to talk about here is altering handles. So this is a way in which you can change how a weapon's handle scales relative to your stats, right? So as we can see here, whenever you want to increase motivity, you have to decrease technique, and vice versa. If you want to increase your technique scaling, you decrease your motivity scaling. Increasing advance doesn't come with any drawbacks, and so this is often a pretty valuable crank to put in because it's always just a buff, never any downside to it. There are different ways in which you can play around with these. Now you do need a crank to change that scaling every time, and in fact you have to use more than one crank if you've swapped it out a lot of times. There's not much to say on this. There are different ways in which you can play around with this. As I said, advance, always a good option because it just gives, you know, assuming you have elemental damage on the weapon, it's just a straight bonus. These take a little more thinking about. Weapon scaling goes from D all the way to S, with S being the highest, and that does determine how much damage your weapon does relative to your stats. There are multiple ways you can go about this, so what I've done in my case here is I added a technique crank to my sword here. So previously, as we see here, it scaled A with technique and D with motivity, but by equipping a technique crank, it now scales S with technique, and so every point of technique I put in gives a significant amount of damage with this weapon. One thing I will say is that stats, as they get to about 30 and beyond, don't give a huge amount of benefit, so there are real diminishing returns, and I think it's likely that as my technique gets higher, I may end up putting in a motivity crank and increasing the motivity stat I have, so that I'm not getting quite severe diminishing returns. And I think that covers everything on stats, weapons, weapon scaling, and assembly. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you would like to see more of me, please consider liking, subscribing, or don't. That's entirely up to you. If you want to see me play more Lies of P, I will be over at twitch.tv/IronsideBrew. Thank you and have a lovely afternoon.